Light transforms ordinary glass into a whispered language of the divine. Those breathtaking cathedral windows are far more than beautiful art. They are a sophisticated scientific code, masterfully engineered by medieval artisans who turned sunlight into sacred stories. By the end of this exploration, you will see these masterpieces not as static pictures, but as living, breathing story engines powered by light itself. We will uncover how secret alchemical recipes created colors that have lasted 1,000 years and decode the hidden physics that made divine light feel tangibly present. What secret messages were these artists encoding in the very fabric of their glass? The answers reveal a forgotten science that still shapes how we communicate with color and light today. What does it mean for a story to be written not in ink but in pure illumination? The story of stained glass begins not in quiet chapels, but in the steamy, echoing halls of Roman bathhouses. Here, around 2,000 years ago, artisans first set pieces of colored glass into windows and walls. This was a practical luxury, a way to let in light while adding a touch of opulence. But it was a world away from the story-filled masterpieces to come. The true transformation began centuries later in the medieval mind, where a new purpose emerged. Glassmakers started to see their material not just as decoration, but as a potential canvas for the divine. In places like the Augsburg Cathedral in Germany, some of the oldest surviving figural windows from the 11th century show this shift. The figures are simple, the techniques still developing, yet they reveal a fledgling, powerful understanding. The artists were learning to use light itself as a tool, to make a saint's face glow or a biblical scene feel illuminated from within. This alchemy was rooted in a surprisingly simple recipe. The body of the glass itself was a mix of 3 common ingredients. Silica from sand provided the transparent base. Soda, often from burned seaweed, acted as a flux to lower the melting temperature, and lime from crushed limestone gave the final product its stability and durability. But the magic, the soul of the color, came from what was added to this molten mixture. Through painstaking experimentation, medieval glassmakers discovered that metallic oxides could permanently stain the glass. They were essentially painting with the raw materials of the earth. Cobalt oxide produced a deep, heavenly blue. Gold, in tiny amounts, could create a rich ruby red. Copper oxides yielded a brilliant emerald or a fiery red. Each batch was a gamble, a secret formula passed down from master to apprentice. This foundational knowledge was the key that unlocked narrative expression. Once an artisan could reliably produce a specific color, that color could be assigned meaning. The deep blue of the Virgin Mary's robe was not an arbitrary choice. It was a deliberate use of a costly and difficult color to signify her importance and heavenly nature. The vibrant red of a martyr's blood could now be rendered with a visceral intensity that captivated a largely illiterate congregation. The material had been mastered, the palette was complete. Now the true work could begin, the work of weaving these colors of light into coherent, compelling stories for all to see. Inside the workshop, the transformation from sand to sacred color was a form of high-stakes alchemy. The artisan, sleeves rolled up against the furnace's heat, worked with a palette of mysterious powders. A pinch of cobalt oxide, ground to a fine dust, would dissolve into the molten glass to produce a deep, resonant blue, the color of a midnight sky. Copper compounds could yield a brilliant ruby red or a vibrant emerald green, depending on the exact chemistry of the fire. Manganese offered regal purples, while a later innovation, silver stain, painted the surface of cooled glass in a range of sunny yellows and golds. Each color was a triumph of precise temperature and careful timing, a secret recipe guarded as closely as any guild treasure. These formulas were not written in books but memorized and passed in whispers from master to apprentice, a living library of chemical knowledge. The result was more than a mere collection of pretty colors. Each hue possessed a unique personality when struck by light. Ruby reds and deep emeralds transmitted a dense, jewel-like glow, capturing and holding the light within them. In contrast, blues and purples created a more ethereal, diffuse illumination, like light filtering through a distant haze. This was the artist's true genius. They used this physics of color to direct the viewer's eye and heart. In a crowded biblical scene, the most important figure, a saint or an apostle, might be rendered in a robe of intense, light-saturated red, demanding attention. A heavenly figure, like an angel, might be framed in the softer, more spiritual glow of blue. The color itself became a tool for storytelling, using intensity and luminosity to create a visual hierarchy, guiding an illiterate congregation through the sacred narrative. But how did these individual colors, these pieces of a visual code, come together to form a complete and coherent story for the faithful to read? Step into Chartres Cathedral at the height of a summer day, and you are not merely standing in a building. You are immersed in a vessel of divine light, a space where physics and faith become one. The sun outside is a brilliant white, but inside, the air itself is painted in deep sapphire, ruby, and gold. This transformation is not magic. It is the direct result of light's intimate dance with colored glass. When a beam of sunlight strikes a pane of red glass, a hidden filtration occurs. The glass itself is saturated with particles of copper or gold, and these particles act like a net, absorbing most of the light's wavelengths. They greedily swallow the greens and blues, but they allow the deep, passionate reds to pass through. That is why a red robe glows with such intense internal fire. A blue pane colored with cobalt does the opposite, transmitting cool, celestial blues while absorbing the warmer tones. This is the secret science of transmission, where every color is a selective filter for pure white light. But the artisans did not stop there. They sculpted the very texture of the glass to control the character of this transmitted light. A pane that was left smooth and polished would cut through the dusty air with a sharp, brilliant beam, a lance of pure color that felt like a direct message from heaven. Yet more often, the glass was deliberately textured. It was hammered into a subtly wavy surface, or its cooling surface was etched. This rough texture acted as a built-in diffuser, scattering the light as it passed through. The result was not a sharp beam, but a soft, ethereal glow that seemed to fill the entire space, making the light feel less like a ray and more like a tangible presence. This was a deliberate emotional calculus. A scene of Christ's Passion might use sharp, clear glass for the crown of thorns, making its painful detail stark and immediate. A depiction of a gentle angelic annunciation, however, would glow from within a softly hammered pane, the light itself feeling benevolent and warm. The thickness of the glass was another variable in this equation. Thicker glass absorbed more light, creating deeper, more somber jewel tones, while thinner sheets allowed for a brighter, more vibrant illumination. Every physical property was a brush in the artist's hand. They were not just telling stories with pictures. They were using the physics of refraction and diffusion to make the divine feel tangibly, emotionally present, crafting an experience of light that was itself a form of theology. The stone framework itself became an active narrator in this luminous story. Early Romanesque churches featured small, rounded windows that pierced thick, fortress-like walls. These openings let in just enough light to reveal the vibrant glass within, creating intimate, jewel box spaces where each window was a precious object to be contemplated up close. But then, a structural revolution changed everything. The invention of the flying buttress allowed builders to shift the weight of the roof outward. Suddenly, the heavy walls were no longer load-bearing. They could be replaced quite literally with walls of glass. This was the birth of the Gothic era, and with it came new window shapes engineered for narrative grandeur. Tall, narrow lancet windows shot upward like flames, their form naturally guiding the viewer's gaze toward heaven. Artists used this vertical space to tell stories of ascent, saints rising to glory, prophets receiving divine messages from on high. The very shape of the window reinforced the story's spiritual direction. Then came the rose window, a massive circle of stone and glass that filled entire walls with radiant symmetry. This circular form presented not a linear tale, but a vision of cosmic order. In these magnificent wheels, every biblical king, every angelic host, every symbolic creature found its place in a perfect, balanced hierarchy radiating from a central Christ figure. It was theology rendered as geometry. Nowhere is this symbiotic relationship between stone and light more breathtakingly clear than in Paris's Sainte-Chapelle. Built to house sacred relics, the chapel is less a building made of stone and more a delicate cage of stained glass held together by the slimmest of piers. The walls have been almost entirely eliminated, replaced by towering windows that stretch from floor to vaulted ceiling. Here, the architecture does not simply frame the glass, it serves it. The stone skeleton exists for one purpose: to support an overwhelming narrative of biblical history written in 15 vast windows. You stand inside a jewel, immersed in a story made entirely of colored light. This perfect partnership between the mason's chisel and the glassmaker's furnace created the ultimate canvas, setting the stage for a new language of visual storytelling that anyone, learned or illiterate, could understand. High above the altar at Wells Cathedral, the Jesse window tells a story that unfolds like a living tree. A sleeping figure of Jesse rests at the base, and from his side springs a vibrant vine that climbs upward, branching through kings and prophets until it culminates in the figure of Christ at the very top. This vertical journey is a masterclass in sequential storytelling. For a medieval congregant, the path was intuitive. You simply started at the bottom and followed the vine upward, panel by panel, watching a divine lineage grow across generations. The story was read as clearly as a modern comic strip, with each glowing frame representing a distinct moment in a grand, chronological narrative. This was the first and most fundamental principle of stained glass communication, the art of the sequence. Artists filled entire walls with such progressions, guiding viewers through the epic tales of David and Goliath or the life of the Virgin Mary from start to finish. They used clever compositional tricks to ensure the narrative flow was impossible to miss. A figure in one panel would point his spear or direct his gaze directly toward the next scene in the sequence, pulling your eye along the intended path. A recurring symbolic object, like a specific type of crown or a lamb, would appear in successive panels, creating a visual thread to follow. Even the background colors might shift subtly, moving from the somber greens of an earthly struggle to the brilliant golds of a heavenly resolution. These were not mere decorations. They were a sophisticated system of visual signposts, transforming complex theological concepts of prophecy and fulfillment into a clear, upward journey that anyone could understand. This linear approach made the immense scope of biblical history feel personal and immediate. Yet, this was only one way to tell a story in light. What happened when artists abandoned the timeline and tried to capture an entire belief system in a single, breathtaking glance? But the sequential story was only half the language. In the great windows of Canterbury Cathedral, a second, more complex narrative principle unfolds. Here, a worshipper might look upon a single panel and see the entire life of a saint, from a youthful vision to a heroic martyrdom, all contained within one unified scene. A figure might appear twice or even 3 times in the same space, acting out different moments of their sacred story. This approach, known as simultaneous representation, asks the viewer to read the story not as a timeline, but as a single, profound truth. It required a sophisticated visual syntax to keep the story from becoming a confusing jumble. Artists became masters of spatial organization. The most important event, often the martyrdom or a divine encounter, would dominate the center of the composition. Earlier or less critical moments were arranged around the edges, perhaps in smaller, subsidiary scenes. Size itself was a code. A larger figure was not necessarily closer, but more significant. A figure bathed in a distinct, vibrant color, like a celestial gold, might represent their sanctified soul, while the same person, rendered in muted tones, depicted their earthly body. This was not a failure of perspective, but a deliberate theological choice. It reflected a medieval understanding of divine time, where past, present, and future exist together in a single, eternal moment for God. The window became a glimpse into that higher reality, collapsing a linear life into a single, resonant image of faith. This technique created a deeper, more contemplative experience. Instead of following a story, you were asked to understand its ultimate meaning all at once. And to layer even more meaning into these luminous pages, artists wove in a secret code of symbols, a visual shorthand that transformed simple objects into profound declarations. A third narrative principle wove the entire Bible into a single, unified prophecy. This was the art of typological pairing, a sophisticated form of storytelling where Old Testament events were presented as divine prefigurements of the New Testament. In the glowing windows of Bourges Cathedral, a viewer would see the story of Jonah being swallowed by the great whale, placed directly alongside the scene of Christ's entombment and resurrection. The connection was intentional and profound. Jonah spent 3 days and nights in the belly of the beast before being delivered onto dry land, a clear parallel to the Son of God lying in the tomb for 3 days before his triumph over death. The Old Testament story was not merely an ancient tale, it was a promise written in light, a shadow of the truth to come. Artists did not stop with the visual composition. They used the secret language of color to reinforce these prophetic bonds. If the scene of Jonah was rendered in deep blues and somber golds, the adjacent panel of the resurrection would echo that exact palette. This created a visual rhyme across the centuries, a chromatic thread tying the 2 testaments together. The specific blue of Jonah's ocean might be the same celestial hue that filled the sky above the empty tomb. This was not decoration, it was a form of visual theology. It trained the congregation to look beyond the surface of a single story and to perceive a grand, divine pattern unfolding across all of history. Every prophet, every king, every event in the Old Law was seen as a type, a foreshadowing of its ultimate fulfillment or antitype in the life of Christ. This transformed the entire wall of a cathedral into a complex, interlocking puzzle of meaning. A scene of Moses striking the rock to bring forth water for the Israelites in the desert would be paired with the image of Christ, the living water, and the piercing of his side on the cross. For the medieval mind, these were not 2 separate miracles, but 2 acts in the same divine drama, separated by time but united in purpose. This layered approach encouraged a deeper, more contemplative form of viewing. It invited the faithful to become detectives of the divine, to seek the hidden connections that revealed God's hand guiding human history. And to aid in this sacred investigation, the artists embedded a second, even more secret code, a rich vocabulary of symbols that could convey complex ideas with a single, elegant image. The deep cobalt blue of the Virgin Mary's robe in Chartres Cathedral was a theological statement cast in glass. This particular shade, known as Chartres blue, was more than just a color. It was a direct representation of divinity, truth, and heavenly grace, made possible by the rare and expensive cobalt oxide that produced its unforgettable intensity. This was the heart of a universal visual language, a color lexicon understood by all. Red, the color of fire and blood, pulsed with dual meanings. It symbolized the sacrificial blood of martyrs, but also the burning, passionate love of God. Green, the color of spring leaves, spoke of life, growth, and the promise of resurrection. Purple, a dye so costly it was reserved for emperors, naturally denoted royalty, but also the solemnity of penitence and mourning. White, or the clear light of untinted glass, stood for purity, innocence, and the very essence of divine light itself. This system transformed the cathedral into a giant, illuminated book. An illiterate farmer and a Latin-speaking scholar could stand side by side and receive the same sacred message. They both understood that a figure in a brilliant red robe had lived or died for their faith. They knew a saint bathed in celestial blue was connected directly to heaven. This consistent vocabulary created a shared visual theology across Europe, a silent sermon written in light that transcended every language barrier. And this symbolic foundation was about to be combined with an even more precise code, one that identified every saint and biblical figure with a unique visual signature. A saint could be identified from across the cavernous nave long before his face became clear. This instant recognition was the genius of a visual code as effective as any modern logo. John the Baptist was never depicted in fine silks, but always in a rough tunic of camel hair brown, his wild appearance a direct reference to his life in the wilderness. The Virgin Mary was almost universally clothed in a robe of deep, heavenly blue, often covered by a mantle of vibrant red, symbolizing her dual nature as both human mother and queen of heaven. Saint Peter was never without his iconic pair of golden yellow keys, the symbol of the authority given to him by Christ. This system of character coding was deliberate and precise, a shared visual language that allowed artists to communicate complex identities with breathtaking efficiency. These color and symbol combinations worked like a uniform, telling the viewer exactly who they were looking at and what that person represented. Beyond color, posture and gesture added layers of meaning. A saint holding a book was likely an evangelist or a church father, a teacher of the word. One holding a model of a building was often its patron saint. A martyr might calmly hold the instrument of their own torture, a palm frond signaling their heavenly victory. Even the relative size of figures was a deliberate code, not a mistake in perspective. A larger figure was a more important figure, their spiritual magnitude literally overshadowing those of lesser hierarchical status. Christ or the Virgin Mary would tower over the apostles, who in turn would be larger than the common people or donors depicted at the edges of a scene. This visual hierarchy instantly communicated the sacred chain of being, from the divine down to the earthly. This sophisticated system of character coding allowed artists to pack entire libraries of theological meaning into a single window. A congregant did not need to be able to read the Latin inscriptions to understand that the man in brown with the lamb was John the Baptist, proclaiming the coming of Christ. They knew the woman in blue and red, crowned with stars, was Mary, the Queen of Heaven. They understood that the old man with the keys held the power to bind and loose in heaven and on earth. This visual shorthand was the final piece of the narrative puzzle, working seamlessly with the sequential stories, the symbolic pairings, and the architectural frames. It ensured that the luminous stories in the glass were not a confusing mystery, but an open book for all to read. But how did the artists ensure this book was read in the right order, guiding the viewer's gaze on a deliberate spiritual journey through the sacred space? The design of a medieval cathedral was a carefully orchestrated spiritual journey, written in stone and light. As you stepped through the main door on the western end, you were immediately confronted with the most terrifying and awe-inspiring spectacle the church could offer. Towering above you in the great west wall was the Last Judgment. Here, in a symphony of fiery reds and solemn blues, Christ sat in majesty, dividing the saved from the damned. This placement was profoundly symbolic. The setting sun each evening bathed this scene in a dying light, a daily reminder of mortality and the final reckoning that awaited every soul. You began your spiritual passage literally under the eyes of your final judge, moving from this cosmic finale into the nave, the long central hall. You entered the realm of human history and learning. The north side of the church, perpetually in shadow and cold, was considered the earthly, pre-Christian world. Its windows were naturally dedicated to stories of creation, the Old Testament patriarchs and the prophets. These narratives, rendered in cooler, deeper colors, told of a time before divine grace, a world waiting for the light. Then you turned to the south side, bathed in warm, direct sunlight throughout the day. This was the side of grace and revelation, filled with the brilliant reds and golds of the New Testament. Here, the life of Christ and the acts of the apostles unfolded, their stories illuminated by the most sustained and brilliant natural light the building could capture. This careful arrangement meant that a worshipper walking from the north to the south aisles was physically reenacting the transition from the old law to the new covenant, from shadow into luminous truth. The entire journey culminated at the east end of the church where the altar stood. This was the holiest place, and its windows were reserved for the most triumphant mysteries. Scenes of the resurrection, the ascension, and the final glory of Christ filled the curved eastern wall, the apse. Each morning, the rising sun would flood these windows from behind, setting them ablaze with light. It was as if the sun itself was obeying the scripture, physically heralding the sun's victory over death. This daily miracle of light was not a happy coincidence. It was the core of the architectural plan. The church building itself became a cosmic clock and a map of salvation, guiding the faithful not just with words, but with the very movement of their bodies and the sun's path through the colored glass. This orchestrated experience shaped how every person, from the nobility to the common laborer, interacted with the stories. The illiterate poor who stood in the nave received the most direct and powerful sermons written in light, from the warning of the Last Judgment to the hope of the resurrection. The clergy, celebrating Mass at the illuminated East End, were visually framed by the ultimate promise of their faith. Every architectural decision, from the darkest north wall to the brilliant east window, was a deliberate lesson in theology, making abstract doctrine an unforgettable, visceral experience. For the vast majority of people living in the Middle Ages, the world was a place without written words. Literacy was a rare skill, confined to the clergy and the nobility. This meant that perhaps 95 out of every 100 people could not open a Bible, even if they had access to one. Their sacred stories did not live on parchment, but in the vibrant, illuminated pages of the church windows. These towering walls of colored glass were not merely decoration. They were the mass media of their day, a continuous broadcast of the most important narratives a person would ever know. They functioned with the immediate impact of a modern graphic novel, translating dense theological texts into a flowing, emotional visual language. A single window could convey the entire epic of Noah's Ark, from the building of the boat to the doves return with an olive branch in a sequence of powerful, unforgettable images. The dramatic tension, the divine wrath, and the final covenant were all communicated without a single written word. This was a democratization of knowledge on a massive scale. The church became a public library where every person, regardless of their station or education, had equal access to the foundational stories of their culture and faith. And we can now understand the sheer effectiveness of this system through the lens of modern cognitive science. The human brain is wired to process and remember visual information far more efficiently than plain text. The combination of striking color, compelling character, and clear narrative sequence used in stained glass is a perfect recipe for creating what cognitive scientists call durable memories. The stories were not just seen, they were felt and remembered. This visual education was not a one-size-fits-all program. In small village churches across Europe, local artisans subtly adapted these universal stories to resonate with their specific communities. A depiction of the Nativity might feature shepherds dressed not in generic robes, but in the distinct woolens of the local region, their sheep resembling the local breed. A scene of farmers sowing seed might show them using plows and carts identical to those used in the fields just outside the church door. These small, deliberate details transform the biblical narrative from a distant, ancient tale into a story happening here and now to people just like them. This brilliant fusion of universal truth and local identity made the lessons of the windows deeply personal. The windows taught a shared moral code, a common history, and a unified worldview to an entire continent, forging a collective identity that transcended kingdoms and languages. It stands as one of history's most ambitious and successful public education campaigns, all conducted through the silent, powerful language of light and color. The deep reds and blues of a cathedral window did more than tell a story. They physically rewired the experience of faith. Modern neuroscience now reveals what medieval artisans knew in their bones, that specific colors of light have a direct, measurable impact on our brains. When you stand bathed in the warm glow of a ruby-red window, your nervous system responds. The long wavelengths of red and orange light are known to slightly increase heart rate and create a sensation of warmth and vitality. The artisans used this to their advantage, saturating scenes of divine love or martyr's sacrifice in these hues to evoke a feeling of sacred presence and emotional intensity. In stark contrast, the cool, short wavelengths of cobalt blue have a calming effect. They can lower pulse rate and encourage states of quiet reflection. This was the perfect color for backgrounds of heavenly realms or for figures in deep prayer, guiding the congregation toward a more meditative, inward-focused state. This was not accidental decoration, it was environmental psychology written in glass. The emotional journey through a cathedral was also a temporal one, changing with the sun's path. The brilliant morning light streaming through an eastern window depicting the resurrection did not just illuminate the scene, it performed it. The rising sun, symbolizing Christ's victory over death, would set the glass ablaze, filling the space with explosive energy and hope. As the day waned and the long, low light of evening struck the western wall's last judgment, the colors would deepen into somber, dramatic tones. The shadows lengthened, and the fiery reds of damnation and the cool blues of eternity felt more immediate, more solemn. This daily cycle used the variable quality of natural light to create a living, breathing narrative that shifted in emotional tone from dawn to dusk. The architects and glassmakers were master manipulators of human perception, using their palette of colored light to orchestrate a specific spiritual and emotional response. They built not just with stone, but with an intuitive understanding of the mind itself. Look closely at the branching patterns of a rose window, and you will find a hidden language of numbers. What appears to be free-flowing medieval artistry is in fact a masterpiece of mathematical precision, built upon ratios believed to echo the very architecture of the universe. The artisans designed their windows using sacred geometry, incorporating principles like the Pythagorean ratios and the divine proportion, what we now call the golden ratio. This ratio, approximately 1.618 to 1, appears again and again in the division of panels and the placement of key figures, creating a subliminal sense of harmony and balance that the eye recognizes even when the mind does not. This was not just an aesthetic choice. Medieval thinkers saw mathematics as a direct reflection of God's orderly mind, and by building these perfect proportions into their windows, they were making the divine intellect visible. This mathematical framework gave the windows a deep, structural harmony, but the geometry itself was also a direct symbolic code. A simple triangle was never just a shape. Its three sides were a clear representation of the Holy Trinity, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. A perfect, unbroken circle with no beginning and no end was a universal symbol for the eternal nature of God and the everlasting kingdom of heaven. The square, with its four equal sides, represented the stability of the earthly realm, the four cardinal directions, and the four elements. When a saint was depicted within a square frame, it was a visual statement about their existence within the physical world. When that same saint was surrounded by a circular mandala of light, it signaled their transcendence into the divine. This marriage of mathematics and mysticism meant every window operated on multiple levels at once. A worshipper could absorb the surface narrative of a biblical story, feel the emotional impact of the colors, and subconsciously receive a deeper theological lesson through the sacred shapes structuring the entire composition. Yet, translating this intricate geometric vision from parchment to glass presented a formidable practical challenge. The lead cames that held the pieces together had to be bent and soldered to follow these precise, often curved, geometric lines without weakening the overall structure. Each piece of glass, often no larger than your hand, was a unique polygon that had to fit perfectly within the grand mathematical design. This was a breathtaking feat of engineering, where the sublime beauty of sacred math met the sooty, physical reality of the workshop, all to create a window that was both a sermon and a scientific diagram written in light. The glassmaker's breath was the first ingredient in the window's soul. Inside the workshop, a long iron blowpipe would dip into the crucible of molten, colored glass, gathering a glowing, honey-like gather at its tip. The artisan then blew into the pipe, inflating the glass into a sphere, a fragile bubble of potential. From this single bubble, two distinct paths could unfold, each creating a sheet of glass with its own unique personality. The first was the crown method. The master would attach a solid iron rod, the pontil, to the opposite side of the hot bubble. Then, with a skilled snap, the blowpipe was removed, leaving a small opening. The artisan would then spin the rod rapidly. Centrifugal force pulled the bubble into a large, flat disc, with a distinctive rippled texture and a bull's eye at its center where the pontil had been attached. Crown glass was prized for its brilliant, fiery quality, as the varying thickness created by the spinning process made light dance and shimmer unpredictably. The second path was the cylinder method. Here, the blown bubble was swung rhythmically in a deep trench until it elongated into a long, symmetrical cylinder. Once cooled, the ends of this cylinder were cut off and its side was sliced open with a hot iron. The cylinder was then reheated and carefully unfolded in the kiln, flattening into a single, uniform sheet. This technique produced a more even, stable pane, perfect for the precise figurative work that was becoming the new standard. The choice was fundamental, a decision between the dynamic, living light of crown glass and the controlled, narrative clarity of cylinder glass. But the true magic of detail came next when the cooled sheet met the artist's brush. This brush was not dipped in ordinary paint. The medium was a special glass paint, a mixture of finely ground copper or iron filings suspended in a binder of gum, arabic, or wine. Applied to the surface of the glass, this paint was a dull, muddy brown, seemingly incapable of creating the fine details of a face or the delicate folds of a robe. The transformation happened in the kiln. The painted glass was placed inside and fired a second time, at a temperature just high enough to fuse the metallic particles permanently into the surface of the glass itself, but not so hot as to melt the paint entirely. When it emerged, the dull paint had become a permanent, translucent stain, ranging from a warm sepia to a deep, solid black. This single innovation, the perfection of vitreous paint, revolutionized the entire art form. Before its widespread use, storytelling was largely symbolic, relying on bold colors and simple shapes. Now, artists could draw. They could render the expressive lines of a sorrowful gaze, the intricate patterns on a king's robe, or the textured bark of the tree of Jesse. This was the key that unlocked psychological depth and narrative complexity. A saint was no longer just a blue robe and a golden halo. They were a person with a furrowed brow of determination or a gentle smile of compassion. The story was no longer just a sequence of events. It was a drama filled with emotion and human detail. These technical leaps turned the glassmaker's workshop into a true laboratory of light. The marriage of the blown glass sheet with its inherent optical character and the precise fired painting created a dual-layer storytelling tool. The color of the glass itself carried the symbolic and emotional weight, the deep blues and reds transmitting their coded messages and shaping the atmosphere of the sacred space. Layered on top of this, the painted details provided the specific narrative information, the who, what, and when of the sacred story. A single panel could now show a king's ruby red robe, symbolizing his passion and sacrifice, while the fired paint delineated the exact embroidery of his regal garment and the determined set of his jaw. This combination allowed for an unprecedented density of meaning. The artist could guide the viewer's eye not just with color, but with intricate line work, leading them from a crucial gesture in one panel to a significant object in the next. The expansion of this visual vocabulary was exponential. Simple symbolic representations blossomed into epic narrative cycles, where every leaf, every piece of armor, every shadow could carry a piece of the tale. The window was no longer a collection of beautiful colored shapes. It was a sophisticated illuminated manuscript, its pages written in light and shadow, its stories waiting to be read by anyone who learned its language. A journey across medieval Europe reveals a continent united by faith but speaking in distinct dialects of light. In the great French cathedrals like Chartres, the windows are symphonies of deep jewel tones. The blues are profound, the reds are like solidified wine, and the narratives are incredibly dense, packing entire books of the Bible into a single wall. This was a theology of immersion, designed to overwhelm the senses and convey the immense, encyclopedic scope of divine history. Just across the channel, however, English cathedrals like Canterbury favored a different approach. Their style was often lighter and more delicate, with a greater emphasis on Grisaille work. Grisaille is glass painted almost entirely in shades of gray, brown, and pale yellow, creating elegant, monochromatic scenes that looked like drawings in light. These windows allowed more clear, untinted glass to remain, flooding the interiors with a brighter, more diffused illumination. This preference was not just about taste, it was a practical and theological response to the often overcast English skies, where every bit of available light was precious, and the stories were told with a quieter, more contemplative clarity. Venture into the German lands and the windows of Cologne Cathedral present another variation. Here, the artists were master architects in miniature. They designed incredibly elaborate stonework frames right inside the glass, creating luminous Gothic arches, delicate pinnacles, and intricate tracery that made each panel look like a tiny, perfect building. This reflected a local fascination with structural complexity and a desire to mirror the cathedral's own stone skeleton within the medium of light itself. Meanwhile, under the bright Italian sun, the workshops of Siena and Florence produced glass with a distinctly classical flavor. The figures often possessed a new sense of volume and realism, influenced by the burgeoning Renaissance. The color palettes were frequently brighter and warmer, filled with clear yellows, vibrant greens, and sun-drenched whites, reflecting both the stronger Mediterranean light and a renewed interest in humanistic expression. These differences were far more than aesthetic choices. They were the product of local geology, theology, and climate. The specific sands and minerals available in a region directly influenced the color palette its workshops could produce. A local theological emphasis on the grandeur of God versus the intimacy of Christ could steer a design toward epic narratives or simpler, more poignant scenes. This rich tapestry of regional styles means that every surviving window is more than a beautiful object. It is a cultural fingerprint, a unique solution to the universal human desire to capture light and tell a story that would outlast stone. These luminous pages of history have endured more than just the slow fade of centuries. They are great survivors, and their close calls with destruction add profound new layers to their stories. The majestic windows of Chartres Cathedral, for instance, faced a trial by fire long before they were ever set in stone. In the year 1194, a devastating blaze swept through the old Romanesque church, reducing much of it to smoldering rubble. The townspeople were plunged into despair, believing their most sacred relic, the Sancta Commedia, and the beautiful new windows were lost forever. Yet from the ashes, a miracle was proclaimed. The holy relic was found unscathed, and incredibly, the three great lancet windows of the west facade, including the famous Notre Dame de la Belle Verrière, had also survived the inferno. Their salvation was seen as a divine sign, sparking the fervor and funds to rebuild the cathedral even grander than before. That brilliant blue glass you see today in Chartres is not a modern reproduction. It is the original, rescued from a 12th century fire, allowing us to gaze upon the same light that inspired medieval pilgrims. This was not the only time sacred glass was saved by human ingenuity. Centuries later, during the violent upheaval of the English Reformation, King Henry VIII's commissioners were ordered to purge churches of what they deemed idolatrous imagery. At Canterbury Cathedral, the monks and townspeople faced an impossible choice: watch their magnificent windows be systematically smashed by the king's men, or find a way to hide them. They chose to hide. Under cover of darkness, they carefully removed entire panels depicting saints and biblical narratives, smuggling them away to secret locations. Some were likely buried in churchyards or hidden within the walls of local homes, saved not for their monetary value, but for the sacred stories they held. They remained in hiding for generations, only being cautiously reinstalled when the political and religious climate had calmed. These windows carry the scars of their salvation, tiny chips and subtle imperfections that speak of their dangerous journey into darkness and back. The threat reached a fever pitch during the French Revolution. Mobs, seeing cathedrals as symbols of the oppressive old regime, stormed churches with hammers and axes, intent on destroying every vestige of the monarchy and the church. In monasteries and abbeys across France, monks and sympathetic citizens undertook desperate, clandestine operations. They would dismantle entire windows, panel by panel, numbering the pieces for later reassembly. Then they would bury these crates of glass in vegetable gardens, hide them in haylofts, or submerge them in nearby ponds. In one documented case, the stained glass from the Abbey of St. Denis was carefully packed away and stored in the basement of a Parisian bank, disguised as ordinary cargo. These acts of preservation were incredibly risky, performed by ordinary people who believed these stories in light were worth the danger. Because of their courage, we can study original medieval techniques directly, analyzing the exact composition of the glass, the brushstrokes of the fired paint, and the leadwork of the assembly. Each survival story transforms these windows from static art into dynamic historical witnesses. They have survived fire, fanaticism, and war, and their continued existence now raises an urgent question for our own time. With this fragile inheritance in our hands, how do we become the next generation of guardians for these stories written in light? The secrets of medieval glass are now being unlocked by tools its creators could never have imagined. Advanced laboratories now use portable X-ray fluorescence scanners, devices that can be held up to a window pane to instantly reveal its precise chemical fingerprint without causing any harm. This technology detects the exact metallic oxides, the cobalt, the copper, the manganese, that the artisan once mixed into the molten glass. In one stunning discovery, analysis of the famous blue glass at Chartres confirmed the use of cobalt, but it also revealed a unique signature of associated trace minerals. This fingerprint was then matched to specific cobalt ore mines in the Erzgebirge Mountains of Germany, proving the existence of a sophisticated long-distance trade network for raw materials as early as the 12th century. These artisans were not just local craftsmen, they were connected to a pan-European economy, sourcing the finest ingredients from hundreds of miles away to achieve their perfect celestial blue. Another powerful technique, Raman spectroscopy, shoots a laser at a tiny sample of glass and reads the unique way the light scatters. This tells scientists about the molecular structure of the glass itself, and crucially, the composition of the fired paint used for the fine details. It can distinguish between a paint made with copper filings from one made with iron, revealing an artist's individual recipe. This has allowed researchers to identify the work of specific master glaziers and their workshops across different cathedrals, tracing the migration of artistic styles and technical knowledge through their unique chemical signatures. But perhaps the most visually dramatic application is computational color analysis. By modeling how light interacts with the degraded surface of ancient glass, scientists can digitally strip away the grime and corrosion of centuries. They can simulate the glass back to its original, freshly cooled state, revealing colors of a vibrancy we have not seen for hundreds of years. This digital restoration shows us that the ruby reds were once as deep as fine wine, and the greens as fresh as spring leaves, confirming historical descriptions of windows that glowed with an almost supernatural intensity. This marriage of cutting-edge science and historical craft does more than just satisfy our curiosity. It deepens our respect, revealing that the medieval artisan was not merely a devout craftsman, but a sophisticated chemist and materials engineer. Their empirical knowledge, built through generations of trial and error in the heat of the furnace, is only now being fully comprehended through our most advanced instrumentation. We are finally learning to read the entire recipe book of light they left behind. Despite our powerful technology and chemical knowledge, we stand humbled before the glass of the Middle Ages. There are effects achieved by those medieval artisans that no modern workshop, no matter how advanced, can truly replicate. The specific luminosity of Chartres blue, for instance, possesses a soft, internal glow that modern cobalt glass simply cannot match. The deep, wine-dark reds of Romanesque windows have a richness and density of color that contemporary versions lack. And then there is the mysterious, shimmering iridescence found on some ancient glass fragments, a rainbow-like surface bloom that looks like oil on water, a beautiful accident of time that we cannot deliberately recreate. So why, with all our tools, can we not copy their work? The theories are compelling. The first is a problem of lost ingredients. Medieval craftsmen used raw minerals dug from specific local mines, ores that contained unique, unrefined mixtures of trace elements. The cobalt that created Chartres blue came from a mine in Germany that has been exhausted for centuries. That particular ore contained its own secret recipe of arsenic, nickel, and bismuth, impurities that, when fused into the glass, created a unique scattering of light, a specific opacity and depth that pure, modern laboratory-grade cobalt cannot hope to achieve. The second theory points to undocumented techniques. The exact sequence of the medieval firing process remains a mystery. How long was the glass heated? At what precise temperature? Was it cooled rapidly or slowly annealed over days? Were certain colors flashed, meaning a layer of colored glass was fused over a clear base? These procedures were not written down, they were a form of muscle memory, a rhythm of the furnace passed from master to apprentice, a knowledge that died with its last practitioner. The final, most poetic theory involves time itself. The unique patinas and iridescence are not something the artisans made, but something that happened over centuries. Microscopic weathering on the glass surface, layer by thin layer, interacts with light to create those brilliant, unreproducible rainbows. It is the slow alchemy of sunlight, humidity, and minuscule particles in the air that have gently sculpted the glass, a process we cannot speed up without losing its essence. This sobering reality transforms our understanding of medieval craft. It was not purely a science with fixed rules, but also a living alchemy, deeply tied to the unique earth and the specific hands that practiced it. Some of its deepest secrets are permanently lost, which makes every surviving original pane not just a work of art, but a one-of-a-kind relic of a forgotten partnership between human genius and the natural world. A pane of medieval glass is a fragile ecosystem, a delicate balance of chemistry and light that modern science now works tirelessly to protect. The greatest threat is invisible, carried on the very air we breathe. Industrial pollution and acid rain slowly attack the glass surface, leaching out the stabilizing alkali and leaving behind a brittle, pitted crust that clouds the colors and weakens the structure. To defend against this, conservators have engineered a brilliant solution, the protective glazing system. A second, invisible layer of clear glass is installed a few inches in front of the historic window. This creates a sealed microclimate, a still pocket of air that acts as a thermal buffer and a pollution filter. It shields the ancient glass from wind, water, and drastic temperature swings, drastically slowing the chemical reactions that cause decay. This system allows the windows to continue their original function, bathing the interior in colored light, while being guarded by an invisible shield of contemporary engineering. When centuries of grime do accumulate, the cleaning process requires the precision of a surgeon. Traditional methods involving water and brushes are far too abrasive for such ancient surfaces. Instead, conservators now turn to lasers. They use carefully calibrated pulses of light that are tuned to a specific frequency. This laser energy is absorbed by the black crust of pollution, causing it to vibrate and shatter into dust, but it passes harmlessly through the pristine glass underneath. It is a painstaking, inch-by-inch procedure that removes the filth of ages without touching the original medieval surface, restoring the window's luminosity without compromising its soul. Before any physical work begins, another form of preservation takes place. Teams use high-resolution digital photography and three-dimensional laser scanning to create a perfect pixel-by-pixel record of every window. They capture every brushstroke of fired paint, every unique bubble in the glass, and the exact curve of every lead came. This digital documentation is more than just an archive, it is a blueprint for the future. Should a panel ever be damaged by a storm or other disaster, this perfect record allows conservators to reconstruct it with absolute accuracy, ensuring that no part of the story is ever lost. This entire endeavor is guided by a profound philosophical balance. The goal is not to seal these windows away in a sterile, climate-controlled vault. It is to preserve them as living narrative art, continuing to tell their stories to a moving congregation of worshippers and visitors. Every decision, from the composition of a new lead came to the angle of a protective glazing bar, is made with this dual purpose in mind. The work of today's conservators is a direct continuation of the medieval tradition. They are the new guild of artisans, using the most advanced science of our time to fulfill the same sacred charge, ensuring these masterpieces of light and story endure for another 1,000 years of wonder. The principles that built Chartres Cathedral now shape spaces far beyond the church. Frank Lloyd Wright's architectural windows, for instance, did not depict saints or prophets, but they wielded the same fundamental power. His intricate geometric designs, assembled from clear and colored glass, were not meant to be looked at like pictures. They were frames for experience, using lead lines and color to transform the very quality of light entering a room, turning an ordinary interior into a harmonious, structured sanctuary. This is the medieval legacy stripped of its specific narrative, yet fully committed to the idea that colored light can define a space and orchestrate an emotional response. Contemporary artists like James Turrell push this even further, removing the glass entirely to work with pure, sculpted light itself. Walking into one of his installations feels like stepping into a massive, abstract stained glass window where the air itself seems to thicken into blocks of ethereal color. The medium has changed, but the core mission remains identical: to use controlled illumination to create a visceral, almost spiritual encounter that transcends language. This enduring influence reveals that medieval artisans were not just decorating churches, they were mapping a universal grammar of visual perception. This same grammar now operates unconsciously in our most popular modern stories. The deep, somber blue palette of a film's night scene is not an arbitrary choice. It is a direct descendant of the medieval association of blue with contemplation, solemnity, and the celestial realm. The intense, fiery red that saturates a frame during a moment of passion or violence draws on a symbolic lineage stretching back to the red glass of martyrdom and divine love. Modern color grading in cinema and video games is a high-tech form of stained glass, a deliberate filtration of light to guide our emotions and signal meaning before a single character speaks. A desaturated, grim world tells us about hopelessness just as surely as a Gothic window's cool north side spoke of a world before grace. These visual languages persist because they work with, not against, the way our brains are wired to process color and light. This continuity proves that the medieval understanding of narrative light tapped into something fundamental, a set of tools for shaping human experience that are just as powerful in a secular world. And perhaps the most direct modern application of this ancient craft is now happening in an unexpected place, the contemporary classroom, where educators are rediscovering the power of these luminous pages to teach history, art, and storytelling to a new generation. A classroom bathed in the cool, calming light of a blue-tinted smartboard helps students focus on a complex math problem. Later, a history lesson on the Roman Empire unfolds on a tablet screen where key events are highlighted in a strategic color code, with emperors in imperial purple and military campaigns in bold, warning red. This is not a futuristic vision, but the practical application of a very old discovery. Modern educational science is now confirming what the master glaziers of Chartres knew in their bones, that color and light are not merely decorative, they are fundamental tools for teaching the human mind. Research in educational psychology demonstrates that color coding information can improve memory retention by up to 80%. Specific wavelengths of light have been shown to directly influence alertness and concentration, with cooler tones fostering focus and warmer tones encouraging creativity. The sequential storytelling of the Jesse window, guiding the eye from one panel to the next, finds its direct descendant in the animated diagrams used to teach everything from the water cycle to the steps of cellular mitosis. Our brains are wired to follow visual narratives, and medieval artisans built the perfect hardware for this innate software. This empirical wisdom is now being consciously engineered into modern learning. Educational designers create digital platforms where a student's progress is visualized as a journey along a colored path, much like a pilgrim following the stories in a cathedral nave. Interactive museum exhibits use strategic spotlighting and colored filters to direct a visitor's attention and create emotional resonance with historical artifacts, transforming a static display into a memorable story. Even the design of textbooks and infographics leans on these ancient principles, using visual hierarchies of color and shape to make complex information instantly legible. The deep crimson used to highlight a critical formula functions with the same urgency as the red glass of a martyr's robe. This bridge between medieval visual theology and modern cognitive science extends beyond the classroom into therapeutic spaces. Hospitals are using ambient, dynamically colored lighting to reduce patient anxiety and promote healing, a direct echo of the calming blues and vitalizing reds that once shaped the spiritual atmosphere of a church. We are rediscovering that to shape light is to shape understanding itself, proving that these luminous pages from the Middle Ages still hold the operating manual for capturing our attention and guiding our hearts. Those ancient cathedrals were, in a very real sense, early light therapy centers. The medieval faithful did not merely see the windows, they bathed in their light, believing the colored radiance could purify the soul and even heal the body. This was a form of spiritual chromotherapy, the idea that specific colors of light possess inherent healing properties. Today, this ancient intuition is being revisited through the rigorous lens of modern science. We now know that light is not just illumination, it is a potent biological signal. Our bodies run on a circadian clock tuned to the daily cycle of sunlight, and when specific wavelengths of light enter our eyes, they trigger cascades of neurochemical responses. Blue light, for instance, suppresses the production of melatonin, the hormone that makes us sleepy. This is why exposure to the blue-rich light of a smartphone screen late at night can disrupt our natural sleep patterns. The medieval artisans, while unaware of melatonin, understood the effect intuitively. They used that same cool, alerting blue for scenes of heavenly wisdom and divine truth, a color that encouraged wakeful contemplation. In contrast, the warm, long wavelengths of red and orange light have been shown to have a calming effect on the autonomic nervous system, slightly lowering heart rate and promoting a sense of warmth and security. Is it any wonder, then, that scenes of divine love and the comforting presence of saints were so often saturated in these restorative hues? The cathedral environment was a carefully calibrated spectrum, designed not just to tell stories, but to actively shape the psychological and physiological state of everyone inside. This historical perspective is now actively shaping the future. Architects and designers are applying these principles to create healing environments in hospitals and clinics. Patient rooms are being designed with dynamic lighting systems that mimic the natural progression of daylight, using cool, energizing tones in the morning to help regulate sleep-wake cycles, and shifting to warm, soothing tones in the evening to promote rest. Some facilities are even experimenting with colored light therapy for specific conditions, using green light to soothe migraine pain or blue light to treat certain skin disorders. The medieval master builder directing light through a pane of cobalt glass to lift the spirit of a pilgrim, and the modern hospital designer programming a light panel to aid a patient's recovery are engaged in the same fundamental pursuit. They are both using the silent, non-invasive power of colored light to orchestrate an environment of well-being, proving that this ancient technology still holds profound lessons for how we build our world today. A digital resurrection is now breathing life back into windows lost to fire, war, and time. In a quiet lab, a team of historians and computer engineers is piecing together the shattered legacy of the Abbey of Saint Denis, where many of France's kings were crowned. Its original medieval windows were destroyed during the French Revolution, leaving behind only fragments and written descriptions. But by feeding every surviving clue into sophisticated light simulation software, they have achieved the impossible. They have rebuilt the windows not in glass and lead, but in pure computational light. The software does not just place colors on a screen. It models the physics of the original glass, simulating how 12th century sunlight would have refracted through the specific thickness and texture of a cobalt blue pane, or how candlelight would have made a ruby red glow with an internal fire. This allows scholars to perform a kind of digital time travel, watching as the sun moves across a virtual sky to illuminate the abbey's nave exactly as it would have appeared to a medieval pilgrim at dawn, noon, and dusk. The results reveal narrative strategies that were completely invisible in the static, damaged remnants. For instance, a scene depicting the life of a saint, when viewed in the simulated morning light, might show a key figure suddenly illuminated by a specific beam, a deliberate alignment of architecture and sunrise that highlighted a moment of divine revelation. At Coventry Cathedral in England, which was devastated by bombing during the Second World War, a similar digital reassembly is underway. The surviving fragments of its magnificent windows were carefully collected, but their original order was a mystery. Using computational imaging to analyze the unique leading and paint strokes on each piece, the team is digitally stitching the narrative back together, panel by panel. This virtual model allows them to test different arrangements, revealing how the artist intended the viewer's eye to travel across the entire biblical story. They can fly through the digital space, examining the windows from the perspective of a worshipper kneeling in prayer or a chorister standing in the loft, uncovering how the story changed when seen from different vantage points. This digital frontier is more than a preservation tool. It is a new form of scholarly inquiry. It lets us experiment with the very fabric of the narrative, asking questions we could never ask of the fragile originals. What symbolic connection becomes clear only when the late afternoon sun strikes two specific panels at the same time? How does the emotional tone of a resurrection scene transform under the gray light of an overcast day versus the brilliant gold of a sunny one? These virtual windows are becoming interactive laboratories for understanding the medieval mind, revealing that the stories were not static, but dynamic performances choreographed by the sun itself. This is the next chapter in our conversation with these masterpieces, a dialogue where code and light work in concert to recover secrets we thought were lost forever. Gerhard Richter's monumental window in Cologne Cathedral replaces biblical figures with 11,000 randomly arranged computer-generated squares in 72 earthy colors. This abstract composition does not tell a linear story, but but instead creates a shimmering, kaleidoscopic field of color that transforms with the shifting daylight. It is a theological statement for a modern age, using the same medium of colored light to evoke wonder and contemplation without prescribing a specific narrative. This is not a rejection of tradition, but a profound evolution of it. The artist still selects each color for its symbolic weight, and the window still uses the sun's path to animate the sacred space, proving that the language of stained glass remains potent even when its grammar changes entirely. Across the world, in war-torn regions of Syria, stained glass is being reborn through community effort. Artists and local residents are collaborating to design and install new windows for churches and mosques that were damaged or destroyed. These new panels often incorporate fragments of the original, shattered glass, weaving the memory of loss directly into a narrative of resilience and hope. The colors and patterns might draw from ancient local traditions, but the stories they tell are urgently contemporary, speaking of survival and a shared future. This communal act of creation echoes the medieval model where the entire town invested in their cathedral's windows, making the stories a collective possession. Today's artists also wield a palette of impossible new materials. Dichroic glass, developed for the aerospace industry, contains microscopic layers of metal oxides that create a dazzling optical effect. A single pane can shift from deep blue to fiery gold as you walk past it, introducing a dynamic, interactive element the master of Chartres could never have conceived. Others are embedding LED lights directly into the leading, or using computer-controlled projectors to cast animated patterns of colored light onto clear glass, creating narratives that can change with the time of day or the theme of a service. These are not gimmicks, but new tools for an ancient purpose. They allow the artist to manipulate time and movement within the narrative itself, making a story of creation unfold over the course of a morning service, or a depiction of flowing water appear to shimmer and move. The fundamental mission, however, connects directly back to the medieval workshop. It is still about harnessing the emotional and cognitive power of colored light to shape a space and guide a human experience. Whether through the quiet abstraction of Richter's pixels or the communal stories being forged in Syria, these modern windows ask the same essential question their ancestors did. How can we use light itself to tell the stories that matter most to us now, and in doing so, build a bridge of understanding that might last for another 1,000 years? Even with all our advanced tools, the medieval glassmaker's deepest secrets remain just out of reach. We can identify the cobalt in that legendary blue, but we cannot reproduce its exact soft, internal glow. We understand the chemistry of copper reds, yet our modern versions lack the profound depth of color found in a Romanesque window. The most brilliant mysteries are not just about ingredients, but about lost processes. How did a master glazier coordinate a team of artisans to maintain perfect color consistency across hundreds of windows for a single cathedral, all without telephones or blueprints? The sheer scale of a project like Chartres suggests a level of organizational genius and a shared visual language that we are only beginning to appreciate. And what about the oral traditions, the whispered recipes, and the intuitive furnace techniques that were never written down? That knowledge lived in the hands and the eyes of the craftsmen, a rhythm of heat and timing that died with the last apprentice in an unbroken chain. This is why every pane of original glass is so precious. It is a physical echo of a conversation we can no longer fully hear, a perfect fusion of measurable science and intangible human genius. The enduring allure of these windows lies precisely in this balance, the dance between what we can explain and what we can only wonder at. It ensures that the field is never closed, that the next scholar, the next conservator, or the next child gazing upward in a dusty sunbeam could be the one to notice a detail everyone else missed, unlocking a secret that has been waiting in the light for 1,000